Picture the Black Sea just after 4 in the morning, the water still black, the sky not yet showing any hint of gray. A formation of long-range strike drones is crossing low over the waves, roughly 40 miles out from occupied Crimea, heading toward one of the most heavily defended air bases Russia operates anywhere along this front. The crews who built this mission plan believed they understood the risk they were taking. Crimea had been hit before, more than once, and everyone involved assumed Russian defenses had only gotten tougher since the last attempt. What they didn't fully know, not until the aircraft were already committed and flying, was that Russia had quietly added an entirely new layer of electronic defense along this stretch of coastline. No drone in this program had ever had to fly through it before. Everything that followed, whether the raid worked or fell apart, would come down to decisions made in real time, far above a cold and indifferent sea, by machines that could no longer fully trust the very signals telling them where they were. 45 minutes into the flight, the satellite navigation receiver on the lead drone updated its position, and the update was wrong. On a screen, somewhere far from the battlefield, operators watched a track drifting toward one section of coast. In reality, the aircraft was somewhere else entirely, sliding toward the approaches of a heavily defended naval port, one of the densest concentrations of modern air defense anywhere on the peninsula. This wasn't some random malfunction. It was deliberate. Russian electronic warfare units had switched on a system built specifically to corrupt satellite positioning signals, feeding false coordinates simultaneously into GPS, GLONASS, and other navigation constellations at once. Any drone relying purely on satellite signals would have no way of detecting the deception. It would simply believe the lie and keep flying confidently in the wrong direction, drifting further from its intended path until it either missed the target completely or flew straight into a defense network built to punish exactly that kind of mistake. This is the point where the difference between a merely capable drone and a genuinely resilient one becomes obvious, and it's worth pausing here because this distinction is really the heart of the whole story. These aircraft were never designed to depend entirely on satellites. Each one carried an inertial navigation system, a self-contained set of instruments tracking its own motion, heading, speed, elapsed time, distance covered, all without ever needing to ask a satellite for confirmation. Its dead reckoning brought into the 21st century, the same principle sailors used for centuries before satellites existed, just translated into gyroscopes and accelerometers. Systems like this always drift a little over long distances. Errors accumulate mile after mile, and if a drone had to fly halfway across a continent on inertial guidance alone, that drift could eventually become a real problem. But by the time the spoofing started, the distance left to the target was short enough that the accumulated error stayed within tolerable limits. Think of the difference between using dead reckoning to cross an ocean, where a tiny heading error compounds into hundreds of miles of drift, versus using it to walk the last few blocks to a landmark you already know is close by. So when the satellite signal turned hostile, the drone didn't simply keep flying blind. It recognized the anomaly, discarded the corrupted data, and switched to autonomous computation, working out a corrected path using its own sense of motion and a set of preloaded coordinates. While that quiet contest between spoofed signals and onboard computation played out inside the drone's electronics, a very different kind of tension was building on the Russian side of the line. Near the coast, a radar operator assigned to one of Crimea's integrated air defense units was sweeping a search radar across open water, and what he saw was not a clean, confident track. It was a flicker. A faint return would appear for a second or two, dissolve into wave clutter, then reappear somewhere slightly different a few sweeps later. That is precisely the signature of a small, radar-evasive airframe flying low over water. And years of drone warfare have taught Russian crews that this kind of intermittent, half-formed signal is often more unsettling than a solid one. A strong, steady return, at least, gives a commander something concrete to shoot at. A flickering ghost gives him uncertainty, and uncertainty is corrosive to any defense network built around fast, confident decisions. It's worth understanding the physics working against the defenders that morning, because none of this was a failure of skill or training. These particular drones were simple by modern standards, small, inexpensive airframes, built largely from composite material and plywood, costing a small fraction of the missiles eventually fired at them. Flying only a couple hundred feet above the waves, they exploited two things at once. First, the sea itself, a chaotic reflector of radar energy, especially with any wind or wave motion, so a small aircraft skimming the surface gets partially buried inside clutter that a radar operator's signal processing has to fight to filter out. Second, the curvature of the Earth. Ground and ship-based radar can theoretically detect targets over 100 miles away, but only if those targets fly high enough to stay above the radar horizon. A target hugging the wavetops effectively hides behind the bulge of the planet, invisible until it closes enough distance for the horizon to stop shielding it. For the first several minutes of this intercept, geometry itself was fighting on the attacker's side. That advantage was never going to last. As the formation kept closing, the curvature of the Earth could no longer conceal it. The faint, flickering returns began to solidify, lingering longer, growing brighter with each sweep. By the time the formation had closed to roughly 15 miles from the coastal defense line, the Russian officer's screen was filling with a scatter of small, moving points, each one a possible threat, each one also possibly nothing more than clutter or a decoy. Nobody in that command post was willing to gamble that any of them were noise, and this is exactly the moment where a small, cheap drone raid starts to punch far above its actual weight. It forces every single point on the screen to be treated as a genuine threat until proven otherwise, and treating dozens of ambiguous contacts as genuine threats all at once is precisely the kind of workload that overwhelms an air defense network built primarily around a handful of fast, high-value targets like manned aircraft or cruise missiles. Then the formation split. One group turned toward a secondary airfield. Another raced for the ferry crossing linking the Russian mainland to the peninsula, a logistics choke point of enormous strategic weight. The largest group turned toward the primary target, an airfield where Russia bases strike aircraft, stores unmanned systems, and services the equipment that keeps its air campaign against Ukraine running. This is where the defensive math starts to collapse for the side on the ground. Every air defense battery has a finite number of fire control channels, discrete tracking and engagement lines that can lock onto one target at a time. Imagine an emergency switchboard built to handle a handful of calls at once, suddenly flooded with dozens of incoming calls simultaneously, each one potentially real, none of them safe to ignore. That's functionally what happens to an integrated air defense system the moment a drone swarm splits across multiple simultaneous axes of attack. Radar assets that would normally reinforce one another become isolated, each forced to fight its own sector alone, while commanders make rapid triage decisions about which return deserves an expensive interceptor, and which one might safely be written off at the risk of being catastrophically wrong. There's a brutal economic asymmetry buried inside this entire tactical problem, and it shapes the whole logic of modern drone warfare. A single surface-to-air missile fired to intercept one of these cheap drones can cost many times more than the drone itself. Every launch draws down a finite stockpile of expensive interceptors that can't be quickly replenished, especially under wartime sanctions and supply constraints. But failing to fire isn't a real option either, because even one drone slipping through a gap can strike a fuel depot, a runway, a hangar, or a logistics node, causing damage that vastly outweighs the cost of the interceptor that would have stopped it. This is the trap that swarming drone tactics are specifically built to spring. The attacker doesn't need every drone to survive. It doesn't even need most of them to reach the target. It only needs to force the defender into a lose-lose calculation, burn through scarce, expensive munitions on cheap decoys, while the resulting confusion and channel saturation lets at least a handful of drones slip through the gaps that saturation inevitably creates. The battery commander responsible for that coastal defense line had spent his entire career training to intercept fighter aircraft and cruise missiles. Fast, high altitude, high-value targets with predictable flight profiles. Nothing in that training specifically prepared him to fight a swarm of slow, cheap, low-flying airframes made of plywood and composite panels. There was no time for reflection in the moment, though. He picked the nearest cluster of returns and gave the order to fire. A volley of long-range interceptors left their launchers within seconds of each other, climbing rapidly before nosing over to dive back toward the wave-skimming targets below. It's genuinely strange, from a purely technical standpoint, watching a sophisticated system engineered to shoot down supersonic cruise missiles and manned strike aircraft instead being asked to hunt something closer to a slow-moving hobbyist aircraft skimming the waterline. The first missile detonated ahead of the formation, throwing a plume of seawater into the pale early light. A second exploded to one side without finding anything. A third detonated prematurely, its proximity fuse apparently confused by radar reflections bouncing off the chaotic wave surface. A fourth came close, detonating near one of the drones, yet the airframe pushed through the spray and kept flying. That repeated near-miss pattern traces back to the same physical limitations that made detection so difficult in the first place. A missile's proximity fuse is built to recognize a target that's relatively large, relatively stable, and clearly distinct from its background. A small drone skimming a churning sea doesn't give it that. Its radar signature blends uncomfortably close to the noise thrown up by the water, and separating a real airframe from wave clutter. In the milliseconds, a fuse has to decide whether to detonate is an extraordinarily hard sensing problem. It's a bit like installing an elaborate home security system with cameras on every doorway and motion sensors in every hallway, only to have the intruder turn out to be a mouse slipping along the baseboards. The system isn't broken, it was simply calibrated, understandably, for a much larger and more conventional kind of threat. Meanwhile, the picture on the defending commander's display kept getting harder to manage. Low-altitude returns flickered in and out of clutter, never staying stable long enough to build a trustworthy track. Higher altitude returns likely decoys or secondary elements of the formation, were far easier to see and lock onto, which created its own trap, since committing scarce interceptors against clear but less important targets risked leaving the genuinely dangerous harder to track low flyers, free to continue toward the main airfield. That was the entire logic behind the raid's design. The attacking side never needed every drone to survive. It needed the defending network to believe that every direction, every altitude, and every flickering blip could plausibly be the most dangerous thing on the board. Once the formation split, coastal defenses split with it, and radar coverage that normally overlaps and reinforces itself instead became patchy and isolated, each sector left to fend for itself against an ambiguous, multi-directional threat. 8 of the drones eventually broke away from what had effectively become a decoy engagement near the coast, and turned deeper into the interior of the peninsula, toward the primary airbase that the entire raid had been designed around. Ahead of them lay open, low-lying steppe terrain, offering no forest cover, no urban clutter, nothing to hide behind. Terrain Russia had layered with long-range radar, electronic warfare stations, mobile missile batteries, and anti-aircraft guns, specifically to turn the approach into a gauntlet. On paper, that network still looked formidable. In practice, by this point in the raid, it was no longer functioning as a coherent whole. Part of its radar capacity was still chasing decoy returns out over the water. Part of its fire control channels were already committed. A meaningful chunk of its missile inventory had already been spent trying, and largely failing, to intercept targets that turned out far harder to kill than expected. The 8 remaining drones flew directly into that gap, low enough, cheap enough, numerous enough, and patient enough to have forced one of the most heavily defended stretches of airspace in the region to fracture its own strength before the true main effort had even arrived. Russian defenders recognized the deeper problem fairly quickly. This was never simply a matter of shooting down individual drones. It was a matter of an entire integrated air defense system being manipulated into making the wrong decisions before the actual point of main effort ever showed up on scope. The 8 remaining aircraft pushed across the open steppe, exposed but still difficult to intercept cleanly, until they entered the engagement envelope of a mobile, short-range air defense system positioned roughly 8 miles short of the airfield, a vehicle combining both missiles and rapid-fire cannons in one platform, built exactly for this kind of close-in, low-altitude threat. Its crew had received cueing data minutes earlier, and their radar picked up the incoming formation with far more clarity than the coastal batteries had managed, since at this shorter range, the curvature of the Earth no longer offered any concealment at all. The tracking radar locked cleanly this time. 2 missiles launched in quick succession, closing the remaining distance in seconds, leaving the drones almost no time to react. The lead aircraft was destroyed outright. A second missile struck a nearby drone moments later, tearing away a wing and sending it spiraling into the ground. In the span of a few seconds, the formation had been cut from 8 aircraft to 6. This is exactly the range band where medium and long-range interceptors perform at their best, when there's enough distance and time for a fire control radar to track, compute a solution, and guide a missile to intercept before the target closes the gap. But that advantage evaporates quickly once the range shrinks further, because even the most capable missile system still needs enough geometry and time to complete an intercept, and a target closing distance rapidly at very low altitude eventually outruns that window entirely. Recognizing this, the defending crew switched from missiles to the vehicle's rapid-fire cannon, twin barrels capable of firing several thousand rounds a minute, rotating to track the incoming flight path and building what amounts to a physical wall of fragmenting metal directly across the drone's approach. For the remaining aircraft, the picture was now brutally simple. Flying straight through that curtain of fire at low altitude with no ability to outmaneuver a radar-directed weapon tracking their exact path in real time would almost certainly have destroyed most or all of the surviving formation before it ever reached the airfield. So one of the drones made a decision, whether pre-programmed as a contingency or triggered by onboard logic responding to the immediate threat. It broke from the formation, accelerated to its maximum speed, and turned directly toward the defending vehicle itself. The crew recognized the change in trajectory too late to fully react, even as the cannon kept firing, and the turret tried to swing back toward the more distant, more valuable target still inbound. The diverted drone pushed through the edge of the barrage, sustaining visible damage, and struck the defending system directly. The explosion silenced the position immediately, and the wall of cannon fire blocking the approach corridor abruptly stopped. That silence opened a gap, and the 6 surviving drones exploited it instantly, dropping even lower and accelerating through before any surrounding defenses could reposition and respond. This kind of sacrificial maneuver, one unit deliberately absorbing a defensive system's attention and firepower to open a path for the rest of the formation, isn't a new concept in military history. It echoes flak suppression tactics used by manned aircraft in earlier wars, and decoy vessels used to draw fire away from more valuable ships in naval combat. What's genuinely new is the willingness and the built-in logic to apply that same sacrificial calculus to unmanned, relatively inexpensive platforms where losing a single airframe carries none of the ethical or political weight that comes with risking a human pilot, and where the economics of the exchange, one cheap drone for one expensive, hard-to-replace air defense system, overwhelmingly favor the attacker. News that the forward defensive position had been destroyed reached the airfield's command post almost immediately, and the local commander understood at once what it meant. The outer protective shield had effectively been torn open, and 6 drones were now inbound toward the runway, the hangars, and the technical support zone. He ordered 2 additional mobile air defense vehicles to redeploy into the hangar area, but combat vehicles need time to relocate, orient their radar, stabilize their weapons platforms, and reach full readiness, and time was precisely the resource the defenders no longer had. While waiting on that reinforcement, every available weapon system still capable of engaging opened fire immediately. Towed anti-aircraft autocannons around the perimeter began throwing dense streams of tracer fire across the low approach corridor. Soldiers raised shoulder-fired anti-drone jamming devices, trying to sever control links before the drones could reach their targets, using the same broad category of signal disruption as the earlier satellite spoofing effort, aimed at multiple frequency bands at once. By this stage, though, that kind of defense had already been rendered largely obsolete for the specific threat it faced. The drones no longer depended on any external control link or satellite navigation to reach their targets. Having already passed through the earlier spoofing and jamming zone near the coast, they had shifted into fully autonomous operation, calculating their own paths, correcting their own trajectories, steering themselves toward preloaded coordinates using onboard sensors and computation alone. Jamming a control signal no longer being used to steer the aircraft does very little good. Heavy machine guns joined the barrage, adding dense streams of tracer fire to an already chaotic sky, and eventually soldiers began firing personal rifles skyward too, some without ever clearly seeing what they were shooting at, simply firing toward tracer fire and engine noise in the hope of contributing something. The result was genuine chaos over the airfield. Autocannon fire cracking through the air, tracers carving long streaks of light across the pre-dawn sky, rifle fire adding to the noise, fragments of spent ammunition sparking against the runway below, sirens sounding across the base. For the 6 remaining drones, there was no truly safe path through. Slowing down made them easier targets. Flying straight for too long made their paths predictable enough to intercept. Turning too sharply risked missing the target entirely. So each aircraft did the only thing available, accelerating, dropping lower, constantly varying its flight path in small, erratic adjustments, banking one way and correcting, dipping close enough to the ground to slip beneath concentrated fire along the runway edge, briefly climbing just enough to force a gunner to shift aim before dropping back down again. None of it resembled a clean, standard flight profile. It looked like aircraft flying as though every additional second of survival was a resource worth spending to buy distance toward the target. Not every drone made it through unscathed. As the formation began its final approach into the inner perimeter, ground fire struck one aircraft directly, triggering an immediate detonation of its warhead in midair, scattering fragments across the runway environment. For a brief moment, it may have looked like momentum was shifting back toward the defenders. That impression didn't last. A second drone took damage to one wing, tilting off balance as its engine kept pulling it forward despite the loss of stable lift. Rather than crashing harmlessly, it continued its trajectory and impacted the runway directly, where its warhead, reportedly on the order of 150 pounds, detonated against the concrete. The blast generated enough overpressure to fracture the surface layer of the runway, damage the underlying structure, and throw debris and displaced earth outward, leaving a crater roughly 30 feet across and 8 feet deep, effectively rendering that section unusable without major repair work. The 4 remaining drones pressed onward through smoke and continued tracer fire, turning toward the base's hangar complex, where Russia stores and services attacked drones before launching them against targets inside Ukraine. The first struck the outermost hangar directly. An explosion inside an enclosed structure behaves very differently than one in open air, because surrounding walls and roofing trap and reflect blast pressure rather than letting it dissipate freely, generating localized pressures well above what the same charge would produce outdoors, enough to blow doors off their frames, tear open roofing, shatter glass across a wide area, and destroy equipment throughout the interior. The hangar roof buckled outward before a column of fire and smoke broke through, rising well over 100 feet into the sky, carrying burning debris with it. A second drone struck an adjacent hangar used to store fuel, lubricants, and drone components. Here the fire didn't stay contained to a single point of impact, spreading rapidly across pooled flammable liquid on the floor and triggering a chain of smaller secondary explosions as individual containers ignited in sequence. Doors were blown from their mountings, sections of the wall collapsed, and thick smoke rapidly obscured visibility across a wide portion of the airfield. A third drone struck yet another hangar in the same complex, igniting a much larger combined fire that drew in debris from stored aircraft, engine components, composite material, and ground support equipment into one intense, spreading blaze. hot enough to blister paint on nearby structures, shatter windows in adjacent buildings, and generate a pressure wave strong enough to overturn parked support vehicles nearby. The sixth and final drone was directed at arguably the most operationally significant target of the whole raid, the maintenance and technical support zone responsible for servicing aircraft and unmanned systems at the base. This area typically holds spare parts, ground support vehicles, auxiliary power and fuel systems, compressed gas cylinders, and specialized servicing equipment, none individually explosive on its own, but collectively an extremely combustible environment once an initial detonation is introduced. The resulting explosion set off a rapid secondary reaction among stored fuel, lubricants, and pressurized gas containers, producing a column of fire that reportedly rose in excess of 250 feet, bright enough to reflect off shattered glass and exposed metal across a wide portion of the base, with radiant heat intense enough to force nearby personnel to retreat, while a heavy column of black smoke rose steadily above the airfield in the aftermath. Within seconds, the intense volume of ground fire began to fade, largely because there was nothing left in the air to shoot at. On the ground, the picture told its own story regardless of how the aerial engagement had unfolded. The runway had been cratered and rendered temporarily unusable. 3 separate hangar structures were burning uncontrollably. The technical and maintenance zone had been effectively knocked out of action. Emergency and firefighting routes around the base were partially blocked by debris, smoke, and the risk of further secondary explosions from fuel and munitions still cooking off in the heat. The base hadn't been destroyed by any single decisive blow. It had been dismantled piece by piece through a sequence of individual decisions made by individual aircraft over less than a minute, beneath a sky filled with tracer fire, at an installation that ultimately didn't have enough time or resources left to defend every part of itself at once. Now step back from the tactical detail and consider what an engagement like this actually represents from a broader strategic standpoint. This wasn't simply one more drone strike added to a long list of similar attacks over the past several years of this war. It represented a deliberate attack on the underlying logistics and support infrastructure that lets an air campaign from Crimean territory function at all. By damaging the runway, destroying multiple hangars, and knocking out the technical maintenance zone in one coordinated action, the attacking side inflicted losses that extend well beyond the handful of aircraft physically present that morning. Damage to fuel stores, spare parts, ground support vehicles, and maintenance capacity directly reduces a base's ability to prepare and launch future missions, and that kind of infrastructure damage is often far more costly to repair, and far more disruptive over the following weeks and months than the loss of any individual aircraft parked on the tarmac at the moment of the strike. The raid also exposed a structural vulnerability that runs through even highly capable layered air defense systems when they're confronted with a genuinely multi-directional, saturating threat. Individually, each element of the defensive network performed roughly as designed. Long-range radar detected what it could, given the physical limits imposed by Earth curvature and sea clutter at low altitude. Medium-range missile systems engaged targets within their effective envelope, achieving several confirmed intercepts along the way. Close-in cannon and machine gun systems provided a final layer of point defense around the most valuable installations. None of these individual pieces failed in any obvious technical sense. What failed, or more precisely, what became overwhelmed, was the integration between them, the network's collective capacity to process a large number of ambiguous, low-signature contacts approaching from multiple directions at once, allocate scarce engagement resources intelligently across that picture, and still hold enough reserve capacity to respond once the genuine main effort revealed itself. That's a lesson that extends well beyond this single engagement and well beyond this particular conflict. Modern integrated air defense, however sophisticated its individual components, has a finite processing and engagement capacity. And any attacking force that can reliably generate more simultaneous, ambiguous threats than that capacity can absorb gains a meaningful tactical advantage, regardless of how technologically inferior its individual platforms are compared to the defender systems. This particular strike also fits inside a broader, longer-running campaign aimed at steadily raising the operational cost and difficulty of using Crimea as a secure rear area. Rather than treating any single airfield or logistics node as decisive on its own, this approach treats the accumulation of individual strikes against airfields, drone storage facilities, electrical substations, fuel depots, and transportation infrastructure as a sustained campaign of attrition. When electrical power becomes unreliable, when water supply infrastructure is repeatedly disrupted, when military installations are forced onto backup generators and improvised repair schedules, and when technical and maintenance personnel are stretched thin, responding to one incident after another, the cumulative effect on a defending force's operational tempo and readiness can be substantial, even if no single strike in isolation looks militarily decisive. Viewed through that lens, the significance of a raid like this lies less in the specific tally of destroyed hangars or damaged runway sections, and more in the broader message it sends about the underlying vulnerability of any fixed installation on the peninsula and the resources that now have to be continually diverted toward hardening, dispersing, and defending assets that were previously treated as relatively secure simply because of their distance from the front lines. Following an engagement like this, it's reasonable to expect damaged infrastructure will eventually be repaired, and that hangars and runway sections destroyed in a single raid can, over time, be rebuilt or replaced. What's harder to fully reverse is the underlying shift in operational posture. A raid like this forces on the defending side. Facilities that were previously concentrated and centrally organized often become more dispersed after successful strikes, trading some operational efficiency for reduced vulnerability to any single attack. Air defense assets allocated based on earlier threat assessments frequently need to be reassessed and redistributed once a new tactic, like multi-directional low-altitude drone saturation, proves its effectiveness in practice. More resources, whether interceptor missiles, radar systems, jamming equipment, or trained personnel, increasingly have to go toward defending targets that were previously considered safe simply because of where they sat on the map. In that sense, the lasting impact of a raid like this may extend well beyond the physical damage visible in its immediate aftermath, shaping the defending force's strategic calculations and resource allocation decisions for months or even years afterward. The real question, raised by an engagement like this, isn't really which specific element mattered most, whether it was the runway damage, the destruction of the hangar complex and everything stored inside it, or the broader demonstration of vulnerability within an air defense network that had previously been considered one of the more capable systems deployed anywhere along this front. In practice, these three outcomes are inseparable, each reinforcing and amplifying the effect of the other two. Runway damage without hangar destruction still leaves stored aircraft and equipment largely intact and quickly redeployable elsewhere. Hangar destruction without an exposed gap in air defense coverage would likely never have been achievable in the first place, since a fully intact, unsaturated network would presumably have intercepted the raid at a much earlier stage, well before any drone came close enough to strike a hangar directly, and the exposure of an air defense vulnerability, however significant in the abstract, only becomes strategically meaningful once it has actually been exploited to produce tangible physical and operational damage on the ground. It's the combination of all three effects occurring together inside a single coordinated raid lasting less than an hour from initial approach to final impact that gives an engagement like this its real strategic weight, and that's likely to keep shaping how both sides in this conflict continue adapting their tactics, their technology, and their resource allocation decisions in the months that follow.